in a age after post 9/11 and well as like post Newtown shooting, we are looking at security drills, and we wanted to know how many schools actually fulfill the security drills that they're supposed to do. In New Jersey, this was quite a task because they're required to do 10 drills a year, and they're supposed to mark them down on sheets, drill record forms, saying the date, the time, the type of drill that they did. And so we started foiling the drills from every single school district in like the top 10 counties in our viewing area. And there was a lot of difficulty in getting these drill forms. Number one, the schools would say, well, this is a security issue, so we can't share it with you. Well, it's not really a security issue because what we're trying to figure out is if they were compliant or not. Not really, we don't want to know the inner workings of their security plan. All we wanted to know is, are you doing the drills that you're supposed to do? And so we foiled this information, and there was a lot of blowback. I mean, there were districts that sent me the forms, but they would redact all the information, you know, when they did it, what time they did it. And when we pressed them for the information and when we fought them for this information, they were telling us, well, you don't need to check that we did them, we did them. There was a lot of resistance to hand over these forms. The first reason, you know, schools would say is security. Well, we don't want to know we don't want to know how they do the drills and where the kids are hiding during these drills. All we want to know is, when do you do them? What type of drills? We want to know that you're performing them like you're supposed to according to the law. And so they would send me drills that had redacted information, including the time and the date that they do it. Well, that's no good. I'm trying to figure out if they're doing it in a timely fashion and if they're doing it in accordance with what the law dictates it should. So we actually had to hire a lawyer who sued all these school districts, probably hundreds of them, and to compel them to hand over the information. And we did this, and successfully we did get the drill record forms back. Now, in some cases, the school district threatened with the prospect of a lawsuit. They would just hand me the information and say, oh, excuse us, you know, we misread the Freedom of Information law. But then other districts really fought us. They didn't want us to know. And of course, when we actually did get the drill forms, we discovered there were a lot of discrepancies. There were a lot of schools that said that they did drills on holidays, school holidays, weekends, and at times when school wasn't even in session. And so we felt like, you know, this was one of those stories where it was important to figure out if schools were actually doing the drills that they were supposed to, because there's a reason they're doing it. They need to prepare the students and the school in the event of an emergency and to know what to do if something bad happens. And we discovered that in many of these schools, they weren't doing the drills like they said they were. Some schools said to us, well, you know, yeah, they might have been on a holiday, but that's when we asked all the teachers to come in. And it just didn't seem likely that the teachers would come in on a holiday. And when we checked with the teachers union in New Jersey, they even said that, you know, no, it's actually against the contract for them to work on a holiday. And so it was just interesting because they put up so much resistance to giving us these forms. In some cases, the schools did the drills perfectly. In other cases, like I said before, there were a ton of discrepancies. And so I think there were like various reasons for not wanting us to see the drill forms. Mostly though, I believe that it's just a heightened area of sensitivity, especially when it comes to education. I think that the public has a right to know if the school is performing these drills like they're supposed to. There's a reason why you're supposed to do the drills, and that's to prepare everyone, from the teachers to the cafeteria workers to the students, so that they know how to react in the case of a real emergency. And by not performing these drills, you know, the kids, the teachers, the school body, they're losing the benefit of practicing for a horrible eventuality. And you're also breaking the law. The law says that this is what you're supposed to do. And so, you know, by not giving us those record forms in the name of security, it was almost self-serving because, you know, we were trying to figure out if they were being compliant, if they were compliant with the law. No, we weren't trying to find out, you know, the inner workings of what their security plan was. And obviously, you know, it would do us no good to broadcast that either. We just wanted to know if they were doing the drills like they said they were doing. And in many cases, they weren't.
What comes to mind when I think about a time as a journalist that I have been denied access to something that's important to tell the story would be when I was covering Occupy Wall Street, which was, as many people know, a movement of protest that really took hold of a park, Zuccotti Park in Lower Manhattan. And the presence of journalists there was very important because this was, in many ways, the precursor to some of the populist and progressive tones that we saw in this past election. So journalists were at this park chronicling every day what the protesters were saying, what they were doing, what they were thinking. And the day on which the NYPD planned to remove the protesters from the park, the journalists were denied access to the same space that they were given access to before. In my view, the role of the journalist that day was very important because part of what we do is provide people a window through which to judge for themselves whether the protesters are behaving properly, whether the police are behaving properly in terms of removing them. And so on that day, it was my feeling and the feeling of just about every journalist that was covering that protest, there probably wasn't a more important day to have unfettered access to the protesters, but of course that was the day that we were pushed back to vantage points where we really couldn't see the mechanisms through which the NYPD was removing individual protesters. So ultimately, that was a day on which I had my press credentials taken by the NYPD because myself and many other journalists continued to try as best we can to cover that event. In many ways, it was a historic event, and it was important for our cameras to give people a window of what was going on. The other side of that, if you try to be fair to the NYPD, their argument was there was a safety risk to the journalists themselves. And I suppose that's in the eye of the beholder. There was no journalist that I spoke to that day in Zuccotti Park who felt as though they were endangered or that their safety was at stake. But of course, it's the NYPD's decision to make when they believe that is the case. So it was a moment where every journalist had to balance for her or himself whether they were essentially going to abide by the NYPD's rule of being moved to a vantage point where they couldn't watch the protest and couldn't watch the removal of protesters, or whether they were essentially going to have their press credentials taken so they could be moved as a non-member of the New York working press. Shortly thereafter, I had a conversation with the NYPD. They gave me my press credential back. But sometimes we have to make split decisions. The legal issue is, can the police restrict the access of a journalist covering, an issue of the day, simply because the police determined that there is some risk to the journalist? The courts have different things to say about that. And ultimately, the way it often works with that legal question is it's hashed out there on the street between you and the police officer. You try to come to some middle ground about what's reasonable so that you can do your job and so that the police respects the First Amendment. As far as the ethical issue is at what point in time do the interests of my viewers, being close to a historic event, getting an unfettered window into the conduct of government officials, at what point in time does the ethical obligation to make sure that your viewer actually sees what's happening in an unfettered way override the sometimes personal convenience of not being on the bad side of a police officer on any given day? One story that comes to mind where this was the prime issue that I did was a story we called Disappearing Debt. This was a story about the New Jersey Treasury Department writing off tens of millions of dollars in debts, things like environmental fines or other kinds of fines that are given to individuals and to corporations by different administrative parts of the New Jersey state government. We as journalists wanted to find out not just how much debt was being forgiven, but whose debts were being forgiven. And so we filed what's in New Jersey called an Open Public Records Act request, the OPRA Act, and we asked for the specific forms on which debts are described when they're written off, so that we would know who was being forgiven their debt. The New Jersey Treasury Department denied us that information, and it seemed to us that it was patently public information. The public should have the right to know when and how their government forgives debts of businesses and citizens, to make sure that the government is dealing fairly when it actually collects a debt from another individual or from another business. So in that case, we actually, in order to obtain access, took the state of New Jersey to court, and we won. And we finally did get those documents that showed a number of big companies whose debts had been forgiven, and there seemed to be no clear rationale why their debts would have been forgiven. That story happened to win a regional Emmy. A lot of people felt as though it exposed something that wasn't working well within New Jersey's state government, and I think what it shows is that a dogged pursuit of public records can often result in government working better, because people see ways that government is working inefficiently. And ultimately, what I would say to students these days who think about access to records is that it is a difficult pursuit, challenging a state or a federal government when they are denying you records. And sometimes, and perhaps more so these days than in the past, we as journalists are having to solicit the help of attorneys to help us fight for records. And that frankly takes away from the time that we spend fact-finding, looking for news stories, researching news stories. But you have to pick and choose your battles. You have to, when you ask a question, when you seek certain records, there should be a good reason for it. It shouldn't be a fishing expedition. But when you do that, you really need to follow through.
Government source had sort of a piece of dirt on somebody that they didn't like, that they wanted to leak to me. And it was somebody who was basically sort of going against them and saying a bunch of bad things about them. And they had a little bit of dirt on that person that was not really newsworthy, but they wanted to sort of smear that person's name. And so they asked me, the government source asked me to put in a public records request asking specifically for the information that they wanted leaked. And I think that was sort of a way to cover themselves, so that it looked like I was asking for the information and not like it was just independently leaked. And I did request it. I did put in a FOIA request, I guess. And I got it right back, of course, because that was what they wanted. And then when I got it back, I saw the document that they wanted me to see, that had the sort of damning information about the person they didn't like. And I discussed it with my boss at the time, and we just decided that it wasn't newsy. I think that if there had been news value there, a lot of time people want you to have damaging information about their enemies, and sometimes there's news value in it, and you would use it, because that's one way that that reporters and producers get information, is because people's enemies leak it, and that's not always bad. But in this case, we looked at the information and it really wasn't newsworthy, and we decided not to use it, even though we had it. Now the next day, it turned out that the same government source had played the same game with a different news outlet, and they had the story. They decided to run it. So there was a day when it really looked like I'd gotten beaten on that story, and I sort of had to, assure myself that I had done the right thing. But I think I had, because I think that you want to make sure that you're not being used, and that there's news value in the news that you report. And just because something is sort of sexy or intriguing does not always mean that there's news value in it.